Part 2 of session 88. Let's pick up the thread on the tarot today. Let's begin. In the last episode, we talked about different things, and one of the last conversations was about the retaking, or actually the taking of the pictures, and that was for the material. I had an epiphany at that moment, so go watch that. I think it was the last question that we covered, question 12. It was just beautiful answer by Ra. So I think that is the most valuable. No, there is more. There's more in this session, but yeah, there's. I would say that is the most valuable, for sure, in this session. That which concerns something that has nothing to do with questioning and all of this archetypical mind and spiritual evolution, but just practical advice of life. I think it's beautiful. So, in any case, the first episode, or the first part on this session, was loose terms, questions here that Don wanted to discuss. Now we're getting strictly into the tarot, and that's why I wanted to begin in this question today. Nothing to refresh, so let's go straight into the first question that we have. This is question 13, where Don says, "Thank you. I would like to ask you as to the initial production of the tarot, where this concept was first formed and where the tarot was first recorded. Where did this," he pauses and then says, "the very first concept." I don't know if that was an inaudible part. I don't think so, because it's usually denoted there, but in any case, let's talk about the tarot basically. Ross says the concept of the tarot originated within the planetary influence you call Venus. So I guess the refresher here is to remind you that Venus was the hometown of Ra. They evolved there. They graduated from third density. They did fourth and fifth density as far as I remember. I believe they did. I don't know, fifth, I think so. And sixth density, they moved away. This has to do with the quality of sixth density, as far as I understand it. And they actually now reside in the sun. This sounds very strange to the person who is not initiated, so to speak, in the law of one and densities and so on, but this makes a lot of sense because you see, the sun, being pure light, is just the manifestation of pure consciousness in a specific way, right? But it's pure consciousness manifesting this octave of experience, which is the solar system. I won't get into the details of this, but what's relevant is that as we return to source, well, what's our source? The sun. And so even in physics, we can see this. The sun is what provides basically all the energy to the solar system. In fact, all planets, all moons, everything is made out of the initial mass, the solar disk, right? So everything is the sun. Everything is the logos. Locally here being sub-logos, or if you want to get super technical within the law of one, the sun is a sub-logos. But yeah, that is that's where we return. And so Ra being sixth density now, they are closer to the sun, to pure consciousness, unity. So they are able to reside there and sustain, as they say, the impact of light. That's what evolution is in terms of mind, body, spirit complexes. Anyhow, that's that's the home planet of Ra, is Venus, and this happened 2.6 billion. That's 2.6 thousand thousand millions. I see why we use billion in English. 1,000 million years, 2.6 thousand million years. I always think about this because in Spanish, billion is what in English is trillion, which is a million. And it's kind of confusing to me sometimes. But yeah, that's the amount of time that has passed between us and Ra third density. And because we're talking about the tarot, we're talking about third density, and that's where it originated, in Venus, with them. Don is going to ask more about this. He says in question 14, was the concept given to, he pauses and said, let me ask, you said it originated there. Was this concept devised for a training tool for those inhabiting Venus at the time, or was it devised by those of Venus as a training tool for those of Earth? Yeah, that's totally misplaced. Earth at that time was barely having life form as we know it in second density. But yeah, Ra says the tarot was devised by the third density population of Venus, a great measure of your space-time in your past. So yeah, Earth was, I don't know which era we were in, but yeah, very, very primitive. As we have noted, says Ra, the third density experience of those of Venus dealt far more deeply and harmoniously with what you would call relationships with other selves, sexual energy transfer work, and philosophical or metaphysical research. The product of many, many generations of work upon what we conceive to be the archetypical mind produced the tarot, which was used by our peoples as a training aid in developing the magical personality. So here's context. This is why Ra loves the tarot so much, because this was their tool for enlightenment, basically. That's what developing the magical personality is to allow this non-egoic self to be manifested. And so I would think that in our planet, the tarot might not be what we get so excited to talk about when we become a social memory complex. But I may be biased here, but non-duality is what has been developed in essence, or mysticism. Let's put it that way. It's just that non-duality is a catch-all phrase for anything that is mystical, because we're talking about unity, right? So whether that be in Christian traditions or Taoist or shamanistic, we're all seeing unity. That's our thing here. So yeah, we might get excited to talk about mysticism as a social memory complex. But Ra developed the tarot, and they are giving us a little bit of a refresher also as to how their society was, and that was a great relationship with other selves. They didn't have this bloody competition that we have on Earth. Sexual energy transfer work, they develop well, very well, what is the interaction between entities for intercourse and the energy transfer that was performed there. So this is a product, I believe, of their philosophical and metaphysical research. So understanding reality from a different point of view, not from the animal point of view, which we have been developing, basically our sexuality. And so that's very different. It's not very useful for spiritual development or evolution to just concentrate on the primitive and very obscure aspects of sexuality, which is the case in our Earth. The product of many, many generations of work upon what we conceive to be the archetypical mind produced the tarot, which was used by Ra as a training aid to develop the non-egoic personality, or the spontaneous self, the real, the true self, manifested in form. So we see again that the tarot was developed over many generations, and that was to understand the mind, the archetypical mind. So, what does Ra say, or Don ask here in the next question? Question 15, Don says, I'll make a guess that those of Venus' third density who were the initial ones to partially penetrate the veil gleaned information as to the nature of the archetypical mind and the veiling process, and from this designed the tarot as a method of teaching others. Is this correct? Ra says, it is so. So, you see, this is why it is so important for each and every one of us to develop our own way of seeing life. This question is crucial for our individuality, because as we're so used to, and I think this is one of our downsides as individual people, individual manifestations of the One, is that we tend to associate things for being the path. The path is your mind. Only you know your mind. That is the path. You see? So again, while it's very helpful, and we all use obviously external influence and sources and stimulus, things that appeal to us, they are tools, and they are tools to develop our own individual mind. Why am I saying all of this? Because Don's guess is that Ra, those of Ra were the initial ones to partially penetrate the veil. So in their search for more, for knowing themselves, right? That itchy question, who am I? What is this universe? What's my purpose? And so on. All of these philosophical questions that are simply the result of self-awareness. This is not something that a bird concerns itself with, or a worm, or a cow, or even a dog. They're not concerned with these questions. They're barely concerned with moving, eating, and realizing that they are something. But we humans have self-awareness, and so we start asking these questions. Who am I? Who are you? And what is this universe? Where am I? These questions are going to start to pave the road for the penetration of the veil, if that makes sense. And so those who were partially able to penetrate the veil, they gleaned information as to the nature of the archetypical mind and the veiling process. So noticing, wait a minute, there's something beyond this that has a sort of dynamic with reality. And furthermore, there is something that is veiling me from that information. Let's find out how we can get more information about this, right? And so mysticism is born. The key point here for my case is that as we do this, we begin to see our own path. We begin to see our own way of understanding reality. This is why Ra suggested, out of the methods that were available to Don and Carla and Jim, they suggested pick astrology, pick the Tree of Life, or Tarot. Just don't mix them. It's going to be difficult. I mean, you can, people have tried, but you might want to just use one, because they are tools. They're not supposed to be things that you mastered to acquire something. just a tool. You can be a master at using a knife, but if you don't cut anything, then what's it worth? It's all for show, right? So that's my point. That these are tools, and we need to use them for our own individual development. You may not even need them. You might use something else. I mean, tarot or archetypical mind, actually tarot, astrology, and tree of life seem to correlate to the archetypical mind. But for example, we don't use this in Buddhism. Does that mean we're missing something? We don't use this in Taoism at all. We don't use this in mystic Christianity or in shamanistic traditions. We don't use any of this. And yet there are paths. See, each individual person develops, and you see the similarities between all of them, when they are expressed. When mystics sit down and talk about this, they all say, oh yeah, we're talking about the same thing. This is what happened at the end of the 19th century in the US, when all these mystics and religious leaders got together and they said, yeah, we have a lot of differences. Everything that we say is completely, different on the outside, but in the inside, what we mean is the same thing. Right, we're all getting together to see that we're searching the same thing, and we're trying to express that in very poor language. So all of this to suggest to you, the listener, to trust your own mind and to trust the attraction that you have. I will give you my own experience just as a reference. I am not attracted to any of the 3 suggestions that Ross said. Wow, lo and behold, Gabe has said that the law of one is major influence. Yes, in many ways, metaphysically, especially in trying to understand reality in a cohesive way, and yet these paths are not attractive to me. They seem rather convoluted for my own mind. It's difficult to understand, and so I follow a different path, one that has been just the result of me exploring different things, and that's just what I pick. So all of us need to have our own discernment. And again, this is expressed here to me in Don's question when he guesses that you guys basically penetrated the veil, got information about the archetypical mind, and then continue on. And Ross says that is so. But what else does Don want to say or ask? He assumes and says, I will also assume, which may not be correct, that the present list that I have of the 22 names of the tarot cards are not in exact agreement with Ra's original generation of the tarot. Could you describe the original tarot, first telling me if there were 22 archetypes that must have been the same, and if they were the same as the list that I have read you in a previous session, or if there were differences. So yeah, let's find out about the cards and the 22 archetypes. Ross says, as we have stated previously, each archetype is a concept complex and may be viewed not only by individuals but by those of the same racial and planetary influences in unique ways. Therefore, it is not informative to reconstruct the rather minor differences in descriptive terms between the tarot used by us and that used by those of Egypt and the spiritual descendants of those first students of this system of study. So, I'm going to give my shallow understanding of the archetypical mind, then a little bit of how I see the tarot, and then what Ross says. So the archetypical mind is basically the way in which the mind-body-spirit complex works. Just like there is gravity, there are parameters. These are parameters of existence. And these parameters belong to the evolution of the mind-body-spirit complex. So you can see it that way. there are different parameters that correspond, of course, to each of the complexes that we are made out of: a body, a mind, a spirit. So these parameters are set. Yes, they are immovable. They are simply the way things work. Now, the tarot is a way of describing this, and we have it in cards. We have 22 cards, and there are 7 for each mind, body, spirit, and then there's one which is the Fool, or the Choice. It's my favorite card, and it stands alone, away from the others, and yet it is involved in all of them. Okay, and what is Ra saying here? If we want to study the archetypical mind and the archetypes as they were explained in Venus obviously have some differences because of the planetary influence in which they were. So even though they're part of the solar system, the fact that they were from Venus changes everything. The experience must be different, and yet very similar to Earth because it belongs to the same sub-logos, or sub-logos, which is the sun. That's why they say it is not informative to reconstruct the rather minor differences in descriptive terms between the tarot used by us, Ra, in Venus, and that used by those of Egypt, us humans here on Earth, and the spiritual descendants of Egyptians, basically. The other thing that is interesting here is that Ra says each archetype may be viewed not only by individuals, but by those of the same racial and planetary influences in unique ways. So not only by each individual mind, body, spirit complex can the tarot be seen in a different way, but for the collective of us, right? That's what racial and planetary. Racial does not mean skin color or whatever other superficial description of race have we created on Earth, but it has to do more with the, for example, this gets convoluted, but Mars, Maldek, Venus, Wanderers, and so on. People from Deneb who have graduated to third density. All of these are racial. And then the planetary influence is bigger because it's everybody. So let me explain this briefly. Our mind is like a tree, Ra says, and it's made out of our individual minds, right? Our individual conscious and subconscious mind. Then there is the racial, which is what we, our first distinction, right, as a group, which has to do with origins. So Wanderers, that's why people call it cosmic family. They're talking about that racial feeling, right? So cosmic family, when people, I don't know if people actually can see that. It might just be a romantic way of saying, I like you and I'm spiritual. I don't know. But there is a reality to this. There are groups who get along better, right? And then there are Wanderers who simply come from, a one-time experience. There are a variety of things. These are racial, right? It's how you associate with a specific group. In any case, all of that is nothing compared to the planetary, because the planetary is all humans. It doesn't matter where you're from, what galaxy, what constellation, what whatever planetary origin you have. It's all about being humans. That is much more deep, right, in the mind, and we share a commonality. And even beyond that is the logoic influence, which, for example, Ra doesn't belong to all, obviously, racial or planetary, but logos, you bet they are, because they are sons and daughters of the sun. So that's the logoic. And beyond that, there is just the cosmic mind, which is all galaxies, all stars, anything is derived from the one logos. And beyond that, it's the source of everything, which is intelligent infinity. So this is the tree of mind. So there are differences, of course, in the way we interpret it individually, racially, planetarily, and of course, logoic, I guess. These differences are not important, not informative. Again, we go back to individual interpretation. All of that to say that. What else does Ra say? They say the one great breakthrough which was made after our work in third density was the proper emphasis given to the arcanum number 22, which we have called the choice. In our own experience, we were aware that such a unifying archetype existed, but did not give that archetype the proper complex of concepts in order to most efficaciously use that archetype in order to promote our evolution. So the choice, this is interesting that they mentioned this, because the choice is basically polarity. You're picking positive or negative polarity, and that is a function of post-veil third density experience. This seems to be because Ra was very harmonious, as they said previously, because they were so harmonious. They were, in essence, looking at the positive polarity alone. That's why they were naive and they had to spend so much time in fifth density. They said the fourth density for them was like easy peasy, lemon squeezy. We basically went through fourth density, says Ra. Very easy, very harmonious too. But fifth density, gaining wisdom. You can see that even in sixth density, they're still balancing wisdom, because in their naivety, and they mention it, they gave us pyramids. Lo and behold, Egyptians said, woohoo, we can polarize negatively. Thank you, Ra. You know how much that depolarizes Ra, right? So that's why they're here trying to work they don't call it mistakes, the distortions that they cause of the law of one. By the way, a little side note, as part of the experience of listening to this episode, this totally, aside from the law of one, this year where I live in Pennsylvania, the trees have been overloaded with acorns, and it feels like we're in a battlefield here. So if you hear some knocking, and Oliver likes to bark when he hears this, of course, because he thinks somebody's knocking on the door or stepping on the outside. But yeah, they just, sometimes it's like a flurry of them, and they are startling sometimes. We may be facing a very, very cold winter this year, but I digress. In any case, going back to 22, the choice, they were aware of such a unifying archetype. They knew that this archetype was the unifying, let's say, piece of the whole mind, which is, I like to see it as intelligent infinity. The choice is intelligent infinity. It's that pure, that's why it's depicted as the fool. It doesn't know where it's going. It just follows whatever it is, and it doesn't care what decision it makes, because it's fine, that's faith. It's derived from there, so I love it. It's beyond even law of one, beyond non-duality, beyond polarity, beyond everything. The fool is that which simply experiences. So very well. What else can we take out of this? They knew that this was a unifying archetype, but they didn't give the proper complex of concepts. which in a way shows us that they weren't, I don't want to say efficient, or they weren't that thorough even in their exploration of the archetypes. So it's fine, it's fine that we don't understand everything. Their archetypical system was incomplete, let's put it that way. So it was later that they kind of got it all together in fourth density, I guess. And of course they taught us this to the Egyptians. Okay, let's move on. Question 17. Don says, I will make this statement as to my understanding of some of the archetypes and let you correct this statement. All right. Listen to this. Ra is going to give, this is going to be a very intricate description of the archetypes. Very bold attempt from Don. And while I do think it's really good, it doesn't do honor to all the things that we can explore in the archetypical mind. However, this is what Don says, and this is his statement. It seems to me that the significator of mind, body, and spirit are acted upon in each of these by the catalyst. This produces experience, which then leads to the transformation and produces the great way. Pretty good. This is the same process for mind, the body, and spirit. The archetypes are just repeated but act in a different way as catalysts because of the differences of mind, body, and spirit. They produce a different type of experience for each because of the differences in the three. The transformation is slightly different. The great way is somewhat different, but the archetypes are all basically doing the same thing. They are just acting on three different portions of the mind-body-spirit complex so that we can condense the entire archetypical mind into a way of saying that in making the significator a complex, basically we have provided a way for catalysts to create transformation more efficiently. Would you correct my statement, please? And I'll just comment on this briefly before getting into Ra. I think Don's description is pretty good in the way that I barely understand the archetypical mind, so it might be all wrong. I don't think it is wrong. I think I grasp the basics of it, and in those basics I can see that Don grasped it as well. But there is a depth to this that, of course, Ra is going to suggest that needs to be explored. And that's the whole purpose of getting into the archetypical mind. The one thing I see is that this is dealing, of course, with parts. And because we deal with parts, we always get into that problem, of thinking that things have an individual purpose. And while they seem to do, it's always a whole that is acting, right? And we're unable to see the whole. We're missing the forest for the trees. Let's put it that way. So I think that's the only thing that it's misplaced here. But that is the nature of course, inquiring into these structures and tools and methods, right? It's a necessary evil, let's call it that way, that we need to be aware of and, of course, dissipated when it's not needed. So again, that's just my very brief comment. Let's go into what Ra says here. And of course, they're going to say, in your statement, correctness is so plated up with tendrils of the most fundamental misunderstanding that correction of your statement is difficult. We shall make comments, and from these comments request that you allow a possible realignment of conceptualization to occur. So, in essence, yeah, the correctness of your statement is it's tangled up with many fundamental misunderstandings. So they're just going to comment and hope, in essence, that there is a realignment of the questions. Ross says, the archetypical mind is a great and fundamental portion of the mind complex. One of its most basic elements and one of the richest sources of information for the seeker of the one infinite creator. To attempt to condense the archetypes is to make an erroneous attempt. Each archetype is a significant ding an sich, or thing in itself, with its own complex of concepts. While it is informative to survey the relationships of one archetype to another, it can be said that this line of inquiry is secondary to the discovery of the purest gestalt, or vision, or melody, which each archetype signifies to both the intellectual and intuitive mind. So, a lot to be said here. Let's not forget that the archetypical mind is simply the foundation of the mind, how the mind works. You may be asking, okay, so is there an archetypical body? Perhaps. Is there an archetypical spirit? I don't think so. I don't know. Not in this system. But its foundation is in the mind. That's why we don't care about anything else but the mind. Isn't it interesting that in any spiritual tradition, we put the most emphasis to the mind, because we know the source of everything is in the mind. So that's it. The archetypical mind is a great fundamental portion of the mind complex. And one of its most basic elements and one of the richest sources of information for the seeker of the one infinite creator is this mind complex. So yeah, that's emphasizing this. The mind is the most important thing that we can study. It's not the most important thing, it's the only important thing. Everything else is a product of the mind. It either channels a spirit or manifests in body as the world. But these are the dynamics of the mind. It's the filter through which infinity can see itself for what it is, to have an experience. So Ra is warning that to attempt to condense the archetypes is to make an erroneous attempt, and I think that's perhaps the biggest fault in Don's question. But again, I don't think it's there are mistakes there. It's just that condensing them may not be helpful. Each archetype is a thing in itself, with its own complex of concepts. So this invites us to investigate, to explore, to study each. What does the matrix of the mind mean? What is the whole idea of the matrix of the mind? We all have to study that. And then potentiator. How does a potentiator potentiates the mind? What is the relationship between potentiator and matrix? Unconscious and conscious mind. So all of these things are concept complex, complex of concepts, as Ross said, concept complex, same thing. While it is informative to survey the relationships of one archetype to another, and this is when we start pairing things, right? So experience and catalyst and significator with the others, and transformation and great way, and so on. So while it is informative, it can be said that this line of inquiry is secondary to the discovery of the purest gestalt of each archetype, right? Both for the intellectual and intuitive mind. So it's best to meditate on each archetype first as to what they mean, and then you can start making relationships. Trying to pair them from the get-go, I don't think it can create problems. It's just that it's not as clear. It's not as beautiful. It's not as what's the word? Vivid. You see, the study becomes more vivid as you study each archetype. And this is coming from somebody who hasn't studied them as they should. I barely even grazed the surface of it, and it's a beautiful study. But yeah, what else does Ra say? They say the significators of mind, body, and spirit complexes are complex in and of themselves, and the archetypes of catalyst, experience, transformation, and the great way are most fruitfully viewed as independent complexes which have their own melodies with which they may inform the mind of its nature. So, curious to know that, of course, they didn't mention matrix and potentiator here. Perhaps because those two are prevail. I don't know. I've no idea why they didn't mention here. Maybe I do have an idea. Don didn't mention it either, did he? Let's find out. Yeah, he starts with this produces experience in leads to transformation and produces a great way, right? Yeah, he doesn't mention it. So he's talking about how, because experience and catalysts are the ones before the significator. So the significator is the one that is taking, in essence, all of this. The significator is the one that is changing. It's like the manifest itself, right? And so experience and catalysts are the ones that are feeding, in essence, these changes. Matrix and potentiator are simply the interactions, right? These are the relationships of interaction. And so catalysts and experience are produced for the significator to change, in essence, to transform itself, to evolve, as it were. And so I think that's why they only mention significator of mind, body, and spirit complexes are complex in and of themselves. They significator, again, I don't remember in the very little study that I have done, significator being paired with anything in particular, but with everything, just like card 22. But the significators are paired with their specific lines. So significator of mind is paired, of course, with matrix, potentiator, all of the line of the mind. Significator of body then with its respective other 6 cards or 6 archetypes of the body, and so on with the spirit. And I think it's the significator. Actually, you can see a relationship between significators of mind, body, and spirit, and you can see a relationship between matrix or matrices of mind, body, and spirit. But I personally don't see a relationship. I may be, blind here, between a significator of mind and matrix of the spirit. I don't. Maybe it's just because I haven't gotten fully into it, but it seems that those are the ways to pair them or study them. So then it is the archetypes of catalyst, experience, transformation, and great way are most fruitfully viewed as independent complexes which have their own melodies with which they may inform the mind of its nature. So Ra is inviting here to study them as independent complexes in and of themselves. So this gets more into how to study the archetypical mind. Let's say what else Ra says here. They say, we ask that you consider that the archetypical mind informs those thoughts which then may have bearing upon the mind, the body, or the spirit. The archetypes do not have a direct linkage to body or spirit, all must be drawn up through the higher levels of the subconscious mind to the conscious mind, and thence they may flee whither they have been bidden to go. So let's reread this. We ask that you consider that the archetypical mind informs those thoughts which then may have bearing upon the mind, the body, and the spirit. So here we see again the structure of the mind being the beginning and the end of everything. Mind is movement. So of course is the channeling of the spirit as movement, and the body or the world as we fashion it as manifested movement, intelligent energy. So they are asking us to consider that the archetypical mind informs those thoughts which then may have bearing upon the mind, body, or the spirit. So the archetypical mind is informing our thoughts, which then have an influence in our mind, body, and spirit. The importance here to me is that, you see, since the way we have a relationship with the mind, right? Let's not talk about the archetypical mind, but with the mind, our relationship with the mind. This invites us to meditation, of course. Our relationship with the mind informs our world, informs our vision of what reality is. So that is something to really, really consider. If the mind is doing this, then let's learn what the mind is. Let's understand the mind. Let's get along with the mind, basically. The archetypes do not have a direct linkage to body or spirit. You see, the archetypes have a direct linkage is to the mind. All must be drawn up through the higher levels of the subconscious mind to the conscious mind, and thence they may flee whither they have been bidden to go. So all of this bubbles up from the subconscious to the conscious mind, and then they go wherever they have to go, right? Getting in touch with the deepest portions of the mind. This is, again, meditation, to allow these unconscious processes to bubble up. This is healing, this is alignment of chakras and so on. All of this is the evolution process of allowing the mind to be crystallized, so that whatever comes through is what comes through. There is no intention. Unless you're negative, then you control whatever is coming through, and you become a master of control, domination, and so on. So that's the part that Ra didn't pick up really well in their third density. So again, it's very deep, and it requires so much talk about the archetypical mind, but I don't think I can do that, and we can just go into just the surface levels here. That's just something that is invited individually. I think we all need to individually study the archetypical mind, and like I said, whichever way is best for you, you have to decide that. What else does Ra say here? To finish up this answer, they say, when used in a controlled way, they are most helpful. Rather than continue beyond the boundaries of your prior statement, we would appreciate the opportunity for your re-questioning at this time, so that we may answer you more precisely. So when used in a more controlled way, they are most helpful. This control has nothing to do with what I said just now about the negative path, but in a discipline, I would say, right? Discipline, control way to study these archetypes. And instead of going beyond the boundaries of your prior statement, which they would have loved to, you can see that there. They rarely say this. But yeah, instead of going beyond what you ask, so before I get too excited, in essence, ask us something else, is what Ra is saying. So again, I know this sounds heavy, it's deep, it's asking us, oh my God, do I need to study this right away, or I'm missing something? Let's just make the initial invitation to study your own mind or understand your mind, because I am heavily influenced by Zen in particular. I'll quote Bodhidharma, where he said, if you try to understand reality with your mind, you won't understand either. Meaning, you won't understand reality or your mind. Don't understand your mind with the mind. And he says, if you try to understand reality without your mind, you will understand both. How's that possible? How can you understand something without the mind, let alone reality, right? What is Bodhidharma trying to tell us? Awareness. That is the key. Going back to yourself. It all goes down to knowing yourself, in essence. So it's very simple. Again, this is just my suggestion. This is my own path. It doesn't have to be your own. But understanding the mind beyond the mind is, to me, the most efficacious way. That's why the suggestion always is in meditate on each archetype. You see, you're not reflecting, you're not studying, you're not creating an analytical process. You can if you want to, but the suggestion is always meditate on each archetype. And the people who I admire the most, who know about the archetypical mind, well, they do such a thing. They just sit with each archetype and suddenly things just start coming up and they say, oh, I don't know where that came from. It wasn't from their musings or their reflections, or reflections meaning reflecting. You're reflecting your own thoughts. So that's because we're allowing this manifested self to take care of it, the unconscious mind, to flower up as to whatever it wants to interpret as the archetypical mind. So that would be my suggestion. If you're in desire to study this, when I say study this is the mind, then definitely consider knowing yourself. It'll help a lot. I don't know how far I can get. Let me take a peek at this session. I think there are at least 2 questions that I won't be able to cover because they're way too long. But let's see how far we can get today. We are on question 17. So yeah, let's see how far we can get. And we'll definitely end this session with a 3rd part. So let's move on. Question 18, Don says, I will ask the following questions to clear up possibly only the method of teaching these concepts, which may give me important clues to understanding the concepts themselves. Did Ra use cards similar to the tarot cards for the training purpose in 3rd density? We can fly through these. These are not very deep. Ra says, no, we didn't use those cards. Don says, well, what did Ra use in 3rd density? And Ra explains, you are aware in your attempts at magical visualization of the mental configuration of sometimes rather complex visualizations. These are mental and drawn with the mind. Another example well known in your culture is the visualization in your mass, this is church, of the distortion of the love of the one infinite creator called Christianity, wherein a small portion of your foodstuffs is seen to be a mentally configured but entirely real man. the man known to you as Yehoshua, or as you call this entity now, Jesus. It was by this method of sustained visualization over a period of training that we worked with these concepts. These concepts were occasionally drawn. However, the concept of one visualization per card was not thought of us, was not thought of by us. So here's the whole gist of this answer. Ra is asking, so did you use the tarot as we know it in Venus? Well, first of all, it would have to be very different in terms of imagery, because I am assuming they didn't have birds as we have them. They didn't have Egyptian imagery and all of Earth stuff. So even if they did, it must have been different. And yet, Ra says that no, they basically didn't have drawn cards or any drawn material. They didn't learn from passing on, these very crude depictions of mind. Probably better than words, but still, it's not helpful. We humans at least have a penchant for trying to put things into word, trying to put things into imagery, which is not a problem. It's just to believe these words, to believe this imagery as what it is. So we get into trouble there. But yeah, Ra, in essence, just use mental visualization. And they give the example of church when, I forget, is it the Eucharist, what we're talking about here? I believe it is. This, when, the body of Christ is given to you in a piece of, it's not bread. At least in Venezuela, we didn't use bread. It was made out of wheat, of course, but yeah, let's call it bread. Dipped in some wine. So we're visualizing. We're not thinking, oh, I'm eating a piece of Jesus right now. Of course, we're visualizing Jesus symbolically there, and we're taking him in, the Christ in us. So that's what we're doing here, and that's what they did back there. They simply visualize, not that they took food stuff, as they call it. I love that word, by the way. But just drawing mentally, they had this great power that a lot of people here in Earth has it too, which is the ability to visualize things and to keep them there and play with them. So Ra says it was this method of sustained visualization over a period of training that we work with these concepts. So this is not too foreign to us because, for example, in the East, we don't have, we do have written stuff because we're humans, of course, but we don't have the heavy reliance on text as we do in the West. You see, in the West, we rely heavily on the Torah, Bible, and the Quran, and so on. So all of these texts religiously are sacred. You cannot dare to taint these texts, and let alone introduce something to it or give another interpretation. It is what it is, right? So that's a cancer for our spiritual journey. It starts growing its own cells and just becomes what we know. These dark definitions of religion that we have, especially in Christianity. So in the East, it was easier to just transmit the knowledge without text. And visualization, this method of teaching, was very helpful, I'm pretty sure. I wish we could do this more here on Earth, but okay, the collective doesn't want it so far, so we can't. But yeah, that's how they passed on, in essence, this knowledge of the archetypical mind. But Don asks precisely this. And in question 20, he says, well, how did the teacher relay information to the student with respect to visualization? Ra says the process was Kabbalistic, that is, of the oral tradition of mouth to ear. So Kabbalistic, the word Kabbalah in its root means tradition, but also reception. Okay, so if you mix the two, I suppose what Ra is giving here, because they mention the word tradition, is the reception of information through the tradition of mouth to ear. This is very similar to what we do. In fact, Zen is precisely this. You know, it is transmission, direct transmission of knowledge. This is why I love so much Zen. So I appreciate this type of teaching better than anything else that has to do with text and memorizing pictures and all of these things. I prefer this. I personally, this mind, body, spirit complex known to you by the sound vibration Gabriel. So that's how it was. That is how it was transmitted. Let's finish up the last two questions before we get into the heavy one, which is question 23. We're here, why not? Question 21, Don says, then when Ra attempted to teach the Egyptians the concept of the Tarot, was the same process used or a different one? Ra says the same process was used. However, those which were teach learners after us first drew these images to the best of their ability within the place of initiation, and later began the use of what you call cards bearing these visualizations, representations. Very important here. This is very important to me, because here we see that Ra didn't come here, manifested themselves and say, we're going to teach you in the way that we knew it. It was all telepathically, right? But people were aware of this. Egyptians who grabbed this, they said, oh, this is how it works. But they then drew these images that Ra was imprinting on them, you see? And so here's where we start to see the discrepancies in the images. Who knows where the initial images are? They must be somewhere, because it seems that they engraved them in the stone in Egypt, so they may be somewhere. Even there, I wouldn't put too much of an importance to the images, because I know how we humans think. We think, oh, there is a pure image that Ra gave us. Who cares? Even the visualization that Ra gave us was not the perfect one. It was just their way of seeing the archetypical mind. What's important is the archetypical mind. How we get to it is through the concept complexes, and that to me is the most important part. So yeah, imagery, the way I see it here, again, this is how I see it, is that Ra imprinted this in the mind of the Egyptians at the time. They saw it, they understood how it worked. This transmission was successfully done for them to see the archetypical mind as it is, 22 cards or 22 archetypes depicted in cards and so on. That's where the Tarot was born. The Tarot is a representation of the archetypical mind. It seems that the archetypical mind is also present in astrology and in the Tree of Life. So, lo and behold, the Tarot is not the archetypical mind, it's a representation of the archetypical mind. But one that we use here in the Law of One, because that's the one they decided to use. So that's exactly what happened, right? Those which were teach learners after us, those who in essence started to teach the archetypical mind, they first drew these images to the best of their ability within the place of initiation, which must be a pyramid or some other structure back then. That's within the place of initiation, and later began the use of what you call cards bearing these visualizations, representations. Very beautiful exploration here as to the origin of the Tarot. For those who wonder how this came to be, well, it was a channeling, you might say. That channeling became an understanding of crucial part of ourselves, and which is the mind. And yeah, that was drawn in cards. Much to say here, but I'll leave it at that. Question 22, Don says, this will be the final one for today. For us, not for the session. Don says, were the court arcana and the minor arcana a portion of Ra's teachings, or was this something that came along later? So these are the rest of the tarot cards, which I'm completely unaware of. Ra says, those cards of which you speak were the product of the influence of those of Chaldea and Sumer. So this is probably a good cliffhanger for the next episode, because we're going to talk about divination and how these were part of the tarot. I guess these are all the cards that we can see in decks that have more than 22 cards, more of the major arcana. I confess I don't know anything about them. I have never studied them. I've never even seen them. I know that there are different decks and people have all kinds of tarot. This is where you see the proliferation of tarot as a method of divination, and all the channels and peoples that you see that are asking, your higher self is about your future and all of this. They're just playing with these mental configurations in one way or another. Far from me to judge the utility, the efficacious application of this playfulness that we have with the tarot. Some people have expressed to me that it's not a good thing. And this is somebody who studied the tarot, particularly the archetypical mind, and she used this as a sort of divination, and she was able to see the dead body of somebody's sister and basically told him, and it was predicted basically that she was going to die. And she was so startled by this that she said, I'm never going to do this again. This is not the purpose of this. And I appreciate that. I personally appreciate that. But some people like to know this, and that's fine, I guess. It's a fair game for everybody. Conclusions. I'm going to, of course, go to what I find to be the most efficient use of all of this information, which is knowing your own mind. I'm going to end this with an anecdote, which is the turning point in my own seeking. The word seeking implies, it doesn't imply, it's explicit in the word that I am looking for something. When you filter everything that you think you're seeking into one thing, what you seek is peace, harmony, happiness. Happiness without a purpose, without a motive, without a reason. No reason to be happy, just happiness because it is possible in and of itself. That's what you're looking for. And my seeking, of course, was through, apparently there's a lot of complexity out there that I need to learn in order to achieve that mystical state of happiness that is so coveted. So I went through all of this, law of one and non-duality, Buddhism and Zen and all of this. And in essence, I was massaging my brain or my mind, massaging it. And intellectual stimulation over and over. This is the seeking part of my path. Until eventually, long story short, I came upon the teachings of going straight into yourself, knowing yourself. I never understood what that meant before. I knew that it was needed, but I thought I had to do many things to know myself. I mean, knowing myself as unity doesn't seem that clear cut to me. But it was. And so this was the turning point when taking this investigation of the self to the utmost of experience, then you're left with a discovery, which is, who are you? Or what are you? However, the implications of this discovery is what transforms the path from seeking to exploration, to enjoyment, to wowness. That is the key. And the benefit of this is the end of suffering. Suffering as an unconscious process, I should say. Because suffering still comes up as you have conditioned parts of yourself, of your mind, at play. You have unconscious processes. This is what we call healing, deconditioning the mind, and so on. But this can only happen from a place of knowledge, from a place of knowing, from a place of consciousness. You cannot make conscious the unconscious processes without consciousness. Does that make sense? I know it sounds like a tongue twister, but you cannot make unconscious processes conscious without consciousness. You need to be aware of the unconscious processes, basically. So the invitation is to, again, seek this knowledge of self, as it would be a tremendous, a pivotal point in your seeking, hopefully a turning point like it was in mine, and you'll be able to be free from the suffering that is the unconscious mind, living within the unconscious mind and identifying with that which is not you. That's my suggestion with this. I have nothing else to say or suggest. I appreciate you listening as always. We're going to finish this. There's only 2 more questions, but they're kind of long, and we can spend a good half hour there. So I don't want to extend this more than what it is. And with that, I bid you farewell. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the last part of session 88, part 3.